Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are digging into a classic. I've been doing a lot of thinking this week about our impending 4th of July, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about the American dream. All of the rhetoric of rags to riches and, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and American exceptionalism. And, there is no book that exemplifies that better than The Great Gatsby. I really love the fact that we all read it in high school. Not all of us, potentially, but, a lot of us read it in high school the same way we read To Kill a Mockingbird in, 8th grade or something. But I do think that it is absolutely a book worth revisiting. It is so multi-layered and so absolutely gorgeous, and there is so much going on. The structure, the characterization, symbolism, figurative language. It's just an absolute literary feat. I would really recommend returning to it. The other thing, it's short. It's short. It's 170 pages or something. Yeah, it's 180 pages. And honestly, it's dense in some ways because the prose is so beautiful, but there is so much plot happening. And honestly, it will feel so nostalgic in so many ways. I would really encourage you to go back and check it out. I'm also interested in this book because we all need to remind ourselves, after having done a lot of reading over the course of our adult lifetimes, that this was published in 1925. This came out the same year as Mrs. Dalloway. It came out 2 years before To the Lighthouse. And in many ways, this is a modernist classic. I mean, it's not like an archetype of modernist writing, which we're going to get to modernist writing in a minute, but there are modernist elements to this that I think are certainly lost on your average high schooler, and I think are kind of lost in general. The prose is unusual, and it's just, it's really interesting to put it in some kind of historical perspective. Also interesting, simply to think that it came out 4 years before the big stock crash, and that it came out really in the heart of the 20s, which I think we all, associate it as kind of a roaring 20s book. But it's very interesting to realize that it was being written in the early 20s and was published in 1925. I mean, there are just so many facets of this book that warrant a rereading. Because Gatsby is such a widely read novel, throughout this lecture, I am going to assume that you know what happens. I am not going to be concerned about spoilers, and I think I'll make lots of different references to different, different plot points and different scenes and different events that occur at different times, with the understanding that maybe I'll be jogging your memory, and you'll be happy to, think about the time that Myrtle gets the puppy by the subway, or, the time that Gatsby has that really, kind of ugly anti-Semitic lunch with Wolfsheim. I'll remind you of these things, and hopefully they'll ring a bell. But I am going to, I'm going to speak about the end of the novel well before we get to the end of the lecture. So if you haven't read it and want to reread it, then definitely do that first if you are concerned about spoilers. The other fascinating thing about reading The Great Gatsby right now is something that I did not even realize. Those of you who are on the YouTube can see that I've just gotten my hair colored. The genius woman who colors my hair is a total theater goer. And she was just telling me yesterday that, in fact, The Great Gatsby has entered the public domain. Apparently, it's 100 years later, or I guess it's 99. Maybe it's 99 years that things enter the public domain. I thought it was a century, but close enough. Apparently, when works like this enter the public domain, generally you have a couple of different theatrical productions that will come out of it. And in this case, apparently there are warring Gatsbys. There's one on Broadway that, my colorist is not a huge fan of. Apparently it's really leaning into the glamour and glitz of the 20s. And warring, again, it's the battling Gatsbys, is battling with a production in Boston, which my very sophisticated hair colorist had much more esteem for that production. That apparently is really leaning into the darkness and kind of the seedy underbelly of Gatsby, which on many levels is more interesting to me. But I also just had no idea. I did know that Berkeley Repertory Theater They put on a production called Gats, which I actually saw with my youngest son. I'm going to admit right now that we did not stay for the whole thing. It was this incredible production where they read the entire novel. And it was such an interesting iteration of the book. It was a modern day setting. It happened in an office. And I'm a sucker. I'm a sucker for the idea of somebody sitting down and reading all of The Great Gatsby during the course of one day. But I have to say, after the first few hours, we felt like we'd really gotten it. We got the essence, and we felt like we'd had our fill, which is really lame on some level. The other book that has been adapted this way is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I just actually was so lucky and was able to see it in London with Sarah Snook, and it is coming to Broadway. That is another circumstance where Sarah Snook, it's a one-person show. Sarah Snook essentially, does an entire recitation of an abridged version of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. It is so powerful and so unbelievable. And talk about prose that is just stunning and intricate and interesting and just really full-bodied. It's really an incredible production. So little did I know that we are revisiting The Great Gatsby here on the Foxed page right at the same time that it is entering the public domain, and it is warring, in fact, on major theater stages around the country. For those of you who like an agenda, here is what we are doing today. We will take just an ultra quick look at the biography of a very storied F. Scott Fitzgerald. We will then dive in looking at the cover art on my paperback and the title and the opening of the novel. We will then look at narrative voice. This is a very interesting and I think sort of an archetype for a certain approach to narrative voice, of which I think you can say that Fitzgerald is just an absolute master. We are then going to talk about some of the modernist elements. We'll just describe modernist literature very quickly. We will talk about the American dream, and then we will look at the close of the novel. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this little bio right off the back of my paperback edition here. Here's, for those of you on YouTube, that's a picture of F. Scott Fitzgerald right there on the back. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, 1896. He attended Princeton University and then was in the Army during the First World War. He published This Side of Paradise in 1920, which was the same year that he married Zelda Fitzgerald. And for the next decade, the couple lived in New York, Paris, and the Riviera. Fitzgerald's masterpieces include The Beautiful and the Damned, The Great Gatsby, and Tender is the Night. He died at the age of 44 while working on The Last Tycoon. So I think many of you know Tender is the Night. It was an absolutely beautiful depiction of Fitzgerald's life with Zelda. I also have a couple of different books that are, specifically about Zelda. She's just a fascinating, fascinating character. And for a hot second, I was totally obsessed with their marriage and their relationship. I think very famously, they drank a lot and they were big partiers and were always sort of searching for the next, place where they could debauch. And they were certainly part of that last generation with Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein and all of those people in the 1920s who, sort of expatriated to Europe. In Fitzgerald's case, he had also served during the First World War. So, and I think it was alcoholism that did him in at the age of 44. I do have a book called West of Sunset, which is very much about, it's a fictional novel, but I really loved it. It was about the end of Fitzgerald's life in Hollywood when he was trying to make a go of being a writer in Hollywood. So I think in some ways, we can sort of place Fitzgerald into the sort of lifestyle that he is depicting in The Great Gatsby. But I think, his biography does not, of course, map onto Gatsby's itself. We are now going to dive on into the novel. So I was actually very pleased to note that the iconic cover, which is still, it's on my paperback copy, and I think it was on my copy in high school, and apparently it was also on the first edition, is that dark blue ground with the two eyes and the crying and the mouth. They're very made up, very, very sad eyes. And then underneath it is what looks to me, it always looked to me like kind of a carnival or an amusement park. When I was young, it probably looked like, Great America or something. It looks to me like there's almost like a movie marquee here, which I always felt like the cover was actually a little misleading. I think a lot of people imagine that the eyes on the front of The Great Gatsby look like the eyes on the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which, in many ways are supposed to be symbolic of God, the eyes of God. If you ask people what the eyes on the cover of the Gatsby copy looks like, many people will say that it's the glasses and the billboard, and it is not. In fact, it is these heavily made up, very sad, what look like female eyes to me, and also the red lip is giving a sense that this is a woman crying. But I was always kind of confused by the bottom because it doesn't really look like the sort of party that I would have expected at Gatsby's house. Maybe it's meant to be an image of New York City, but I was always like a slight bit confused by both of the images. However, they are images that are really compelling, and it's just a highly, highly appealing novel. It is still a little surprising to me, though, that it has had such continuity over the past 100 years. So in terms of title, there is, a very fabled origin to this story, which is that F. Scott Fitzgerald tried many different titles for this book. The one that was most famous was called Trimalchio in West Egg. So Trimalchio is a character from ancient Greek. I can't remember the name of the writer, but it was in the Satyricon. And he was like this kind of, arriviste, like a nouveau riche kind of host at some sort of party. And what Fitzgerald wanted to call The Great Gatsby was Trimalchio in West Egg, which is such an uncomfortable and weird and odd title. And his editor was very smart and persuaded him instead to call it The Great Gatsby. So I love everything about this title. I love the mystique about it. I mean, the great somebody or other reminds us, first of all, of like a circus strongman, but it also reminds us of royalty, like the great, Tsar Peter the Great, or that's what I was thinking of. But you have this notion of someone who is incredibly important and someone who is, really at the pinnacle of whatever sort of authority they were trying to attain. But we have also this idea of the mystique and the idea of not knowing. So, the great so-and-so, the great Santini, boy, that's another book. So oftentimes, the great so-and-so would be a very theatrical presence and someone, in fact, that we don't know. So we have this air of mystique, but also this air of unknowingness about a title like The Great Gatsby. It's not J. Gatsby. It's not someone's name. It's not very identifiable. It's this kind of inflated and mysterious sense of who this person is. It's also very appropriate that he be really at the focus of the novel. We have a lot of other very important male characters, Nick Carraway, Tom Buchanan. We have a lot of different people. You could say that, perhaps Daisy Buchanan should be really at the center of the novel. But it really is a story about Gatsby. And what is so beautiful is we are focused on something that is essentially unknowable. So everyone in the book is focusing their attention on this entity, and yet we as readers are just as much kind of in the dark as everyone else, even by the end of the book. I mean, we piece a lot of things together, but he remains certainly a mystery. Also, if we're thinking about the American dream, he's obviously sort of the perfect manifestation. He's someone who came from nothing and, learned through a series of essentially poses and a lot of grit and a lot of ambition, rises to heights. And in fact, all of his success, which is kind of shady and kind of unclear what the source of his success is, which is the case for a lot of American success, because it is financial success that is built on financial markets that are pretty mysterious, unless it's like the steel people or the oil people. But so you have this idea of this kind of mysterious apotheosis of this man, this great Gatsby, and what in fact makes him great is his wealth and his opulence. So that is in many ways, especially in the 1920s, during an age of incredible opulence and grandeur and ostentation and, everyone sort of jockeying to sort of be the top of the heap. Also, that sense of new money, very famously, Gatsby hasn't cut any of the books. Back in the day, the pages would have been folded and you would have to cut them as you went. All of his pages are uncut because he would have bought books by the yard and in fact was not a reader, but was posing as a reader. So you have this idea of this facade of wealth, which is really what is signaling, in fact, this success. And of course, the thing that we need to recognize is that, of course, all of this, all of his success and all of his efforts are inspired by his love for Daisy. So there's a tragedy, there's sort of a pathetic thing that is at the center of all of this, that for me really makes the story worthwhile. If this were someone who were simply in it for the money, it would be much less sympathetic. But Gatsby really does become this tragic figure because he truly is in love with Daisy. He's doing his best, to sort of return to that golden era when they were young together. So it's very much about returning to a golden era. But it is also, it's a story of incredibly deep adoration for someone, or at least the idea of someone. And, I think that in some ways redeems Gatsby for lots of people. As we get further into the book here, we see that it is dedicated once again to Zelda. That's what it says. Once again to Zelda. It's all in capital letters. They're italicized capital letters, in fact, which I love this. I love to think, actually, about their very deep and in some ways very troubled love affair. So good that he is dedicating this to his wife. This copy that I have actually has a really great introduction by Jessamine Ward, which the sort of emphasis about it is the fact that Gatsby is doomed from the start, that there was such an insular situation that he was wanting to be part of that he would never, in fact, be part of. So I really enjoyed her introduction. Then there was a foreword by someone I don't know. It was, kind of a more academic sort of thing. Oh, Eleanor Lanahan. Okay, then we're going to dive in. We have our title page, and we are going to take a fairly close look at the first half of the first page. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. So this goes on a little bit further, but I would like to remind you at this point of an old saw here at the Foxed Page, which is that if you have an incredible piece of literature in your hands and that author is worth his salt, then the beginning of whatever the piece of writing is will really clue you into how you should be focusing your attention. In this case, there is so much here. We have, in fact, Nick Carraway from this first-person perspective, which we are going to discuss in a minute. But we have him discussing his father. So right from the beginning, you have this idea of father figures. And aside from Nick Carraway's father, father figures, in fact, are incredibly diminished throughout this. So we know, in fact, there's a really, really moving and very pathetic, in the sense of like pathos, a pathetic scene that happens after Gatsby's death when his father comes. And you realize, in fact, how humble his origins are. And it's very painful to think about the ways in which Gatsby felt that he needed to reject his father in order to rise to, these American dream heights that he was hoping to achieve. You, in fact, have, his mentor, Dan Cody, who is another kind of enigma. This is someone who has lots of money and essentially teaches Gatsby like how to perform and how to embody this kind of upper class person with the yachts and with all of the money. And Cody, it's really borrowed from like that wild, wild west kind of idea, which should, if you're paying attention, which should remind you of this idea of Western expansion and manifest destiny and the way that Americans, with all of our hubris, just felt like we had full permission to kind of dominate this wild, wild west, but also the sort of lawlessness and the way that people in the 19th and early 20th centuries really felt like they were establishing the American way. And it was one that was very brash and that was, established by these men who were largely made by their fortunes, meaning they were given power because they had a lot of money, whether that was from, gold mines or it was from cattle in the West or it was oil or trains or whatever the thing was. So we have this idea from the very beginning of father figures and their absence. So here, Nick Carraway is talking about his father, but his father is not in fact in the story. And we have actually kind of a dearth of adults. I think of all of these people, I mean, they probably were in their 20s. This is fairly soon after college, which is also weird to think about. And Daisy Buchanan and Tom Buchanan have a very young child. So you have this idea of them actually of being very young. And so this sense of the sort of actual adults, like the responsible generation. I'm 54. I feel like now I've arrived at the responsible generation, and they are sorely lacking in The Great Gatsby. We also have this idea right from the start of judgment. So he says he is not inclined to judgment. And actually, he gives kind of a good little, primer for empathy here. This idea of like people have not had all the advantages that you have had. Although it's not the same thing as saying like you should try to put yourself in someone else's place. It is in fact setting up this idea that you have to have had certain advantages in order, to do well. But you get the sense here, this is a Princeton graduate who is writing this, and he is writing it about Nick Carraway, who is, freshly, I think, from Harvard or maybe Princeton or Yale. One of these schools. You have this sense that he, has been given advantages, and it is those advantages, in fact, that allow him to be successful. And so you set up this kind of hierarchy that is very insular, and in fact is very difficult to break into. We also have this idea of the lack of communication or the lack thereof. Lots of people are communicating with Nick, but it is largely because Nick does not give himself away. Nick is not giving a lot of information. We end up with, in fact, very little. There's that beautiful scene when Nick describes going back home to the Midwest, in between like semesters of school and being on the train. And it's this very beautiful, kind of elegiac and cold and kind of haunting description. And that's, we don't really have a sense of what's making Nick Carraway tick. He's, attracted to Jordan Baker, but that's not really, any kind of real relationship. So he's this very shadowy figure, and yet he receives a lot of communication, or at least claims to. We also have the idea right from the beginning here of normal and abnormal. So this is a book that, at the beginning he says he doesn't deserve judgment, but then right away he is saying the abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality. So you have this idea of him right away as classing people in terms of normal and abnormal, which, gives you this sense of people sort of not being allowed in. Also, in terms of communication, he has this description here of wild, unknown men, this sense of men who don't know themselves, and also men who are still unknown. These are wild, unknown men. You get the sense that wild here means, like they're like making some bad choices and being maybe unsafe in their practices. They're drinking too much, they're driving and they're drinking, they're probably sailing and drinking, or like playing polo and drinking, or whatever they're doing. But you have this sense of these wild, unknown men. The fact that they are unknown is really one of the key pieces of this, even though he is saying that they are offering up a lot of information to him. And then I want to move on and look at the second page, actually, here. It's just such beautiful prose. I mean, as I am reading this, I hope you are also reveling in just the richness of this prose. Try to think whether or not you maybe didn't totally appreciate this back when you were in high school. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So we have this idea here of really leaning into judgment, and this idea of this kind of uneven playing field, which is something that means something very different 100 years after Fitzgerald was writing. But you have also this admission here that his father was snobby, that he is snobby, but that also, in some ways he is signaling to us that he is, very close to this upper class that he will be describing. And then a little further down, we have this very interesting paragraph. This is one of those moments in a novel that really makes me happy. We're looking at it after knowing what happens in the book and after finishing the book. It's one of those paragraphs where reading it seems kind of foundational because you can't fully appreciate it the first time you read it. But when you return to it after, taking in the whole piece of literature, it really has enormous nuance. He says this. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have unaffected scorn. So I can guarantee that more than a couple high school sophomores might have gotten tripped up by this idea here, this very kind of grim and very outspoken pronouncement on the part of Nick Carraway when he says, Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. So you get this sense, you're like, uh-oh, he really scorns Gatsby. So it's you have this sense that he's saying two different things. Gatsby, he's also saying in this same sentence that Gatsby escapes. He's the one person who escapes, but also that Gatsby represents the thing that he also escapes. It's a very interesting sentence, and in fact, it's very difficult to follow in some ways, certainly if you are 16 years old. But it speaks to something very important, which is this ambivalence that Nick has from the beginning of the novel and that continues even after everything has transpired, which, this is a point later when he is writing this book. And even at that point, he has this very deep ambivalence about, how to feel about Gatsby, both having incredible scorn for him and also recognizing that he was this, really incandescent figure. So he says this. There was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any person and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So quick note here, phrases like that, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. That's a little bit reminiscent of this line on the first page we have here. I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. There is a certain kind of overblown elaboration to this prose. The abortive sorrows and short-winded elations. That is such it's just an absolutely incredible phrase. Abortive sorrows is speaking volumes about what, it's so complicated and such a cool concept in many ways. And short-winded elations, he's packing so much nuance into these phrases. They're unique. They're textured, they feel both kind of uncanny, like they feel familiar. Abortive sorrows, those are they're somewhat similar, and yet they feel very different. And as a combination, it's just kind of startling. And we have that again and again in Fitzgerald. That's part of this richness of the prose that I find so haunting and so good. And again, something that perhaps we maybe were not all fully appreciating back in high school. So we're going to spend a minute here talking about Nick Carraway as narrator. He is a unique narrator in the sense that he is telling a first-person tale, and in some ways he's on the fringes of the story. Kind of in a lot of ways. He's not quite part of their social set. He's not quite part of their, economic milieu. He's not quite part of the family. He's like a second cousin of Daisy. So he's on the periphery in many, many ways, which gives him the perfect vantage point from which to tell the story. He, if you recall, is renting the little cottage, which, to him feels palatial, right on Gatsby's land. And if you recall, this is also on West Egg, which is opposite East Egg, and this is on Long Island. So, think Hamptons or whatever. So you have this idea of being a little bit on the wrong side of the tracks, on the kind of new money side of things. So Nick is given, again, this kind of viewpoint, and because he has access to the Buchanans, he's the ideal candidate to tell the story. What's really impressive to me, though, is this first-person narrator, and it would be, first-person narration is famously limiting, and it would be very limiting if Fitzgerald actually, really stuck to all of the different parameters that are inherent in the first person, but he doesn't. He stretches Nick Carraway in some really interesting ways. So I want to take a quick look at some of the ways that Nick is able to sort of, stretch beyond just his first person experience with people. we have these times when he's in this very kind of repertorial mode where he's essentially reporting what is happening. He's also someone, despite the fact that he says he doesn't judge, he is pretty judgy, but in a way that's actually very helpful for us readers, because we, in lots of ways, need some guidance. And we also, in fact, align with him in the sense that we have, quite a bit of, sympathy for Gatsby once we understand how much he is in love with Daisy. But we also have quite a bit of scorn for people like Tom Buchanan, who are racist and super snobby and are really careless with their wealth, and also are so extremely wealthy that it's just kind of gross. So here he is describing Daisy and Tom Buchanan. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. So this is it's such an incredibly distilled and powerful and really well done. I mean, this is page 6 of the novel. We are really getting a very robust vision here of Tom Buchanan. Nick is really telling it like it is. And because Nick is sort of, in some of these same circles, he understands what this is. And Nick is signaling that by, talking here about New Haven, football at New Haven, which is code for Yale. And you would only say New Haven if you were like, someone who went to a different Ivy League school. So, and even then, hopefully not now, but back in the day. So the fact that Nick is saying New Haven means that he's kind of in all of these different circles, and yet he is not, partially because he was not the football player that Tom Buchanan was, and he also, in fact, does not have extreme wealth. The fact also that he's talking about the position that Tom Buchanan played, on the football team in a kind of encoded way is both flattering to the reader. I mean, we understand what, New Haven is, and we understand what an end is, playing an end. It's this flattering thing. You're like, okay, well, I kind of get it. Like, I understand what he is trying to signal because I am enough on the inside of this circle, and I can cast all the aspersions I want, and I can, look down at these people for being snobby and for having, reached their apex at 21. But it's very flattering because you do feel like you're sort of aligned with Nick and that you know enough to be sort of swimming in this sea. But we have this idea here too, one of the most powerful ends that ever played football. The fact that he's an end is very symbolic. I mean, he's an end. He's a powerful end. It's speaking volumes about, what is going to happen with Daisy, the fact that she is in fact going to end with him, the fact that in many ways, his end of his life was at New Haven, and he will just always be kind of, trying to get back to those glory days. Again, it's such an underscoring of how young they are. I mean, they're, these people are like relatively fresh out of college. But you have this idea of end. I mean, every single detail that Fitzgerald is choosing is so meticulously well appointed and so significant. I mean, a powerful end, to call Tom Buchanan a powerful end, is just absolute genius. Also, the fact that we have his family were enormously wealthy. So enormously, it's such a great word. It's not, they were extremely wealthy. Enormously wealthy has a certain, there's a certain kind of padded nature to it, and a certain, like this sense of just like, being like a little inflated and just kind of exaggerated in this way. Also, enormously, it's like not quite the word that you would always use with wealthy. So it stands out a little bit, sort of like abortive sorrows. And it also, the fact that we have all of this stuff about college, and then his family were enormously wealthy. It is followed by an M dash and a bunch of other stuff. But there's an enormous amount, didn't mean to echo that quite, of emphasis on this wealthiness. So Nick Carraway can really, exist very well in this kind of reporting mode where he's telling us, the history of Tom Buchanan. But then he can also drop into this very novelistic kind of thing where you feel like he is a third-person narrator. And he almost always attaches himself to it so that you're anchored. You have context, like how Nick has this information. But then he very quickly, meaning Fitzgerald, very quickly kind of transitions into what feels like a more third-person narrator, which is crucial because that's why the book can feel so incredibly rich, and it can feel not like we have to stick to, the words of Nick Carraway and the observations of Nick Carraway. So here's a great example of that. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens, finally when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. What an absolute virtuoso Fitzgerald is. This paragraph is just such a gorgeous piece of writing. I want to interject quickly here about modernism. So toward the end of the 19th century, sort of 1830 to 1900, we have realist fiction. So that is, think of, Mark Twain and, Steinbeck comes later, but he tends to write very realist kind of fiction. Think of Gustave Flaubert writing Madame Bovary. These were novels that had this very omniscient narrator that sought to sort of provide an objective and sort of uninvolved vision of an entire world. So lots of details, but essentially giving you a report. It was almost like showing you a movie of something happening without any kind of bias or any kind of involvement on the part of the author or the narrator. And then after the World War, you had people like Virginia Woolf and like James Joyce who really felt like this kind of straightforward novel that had this linear progression and this omniscient narrator, that really didn't function anymore. Some people tie it to this idea that, God is dead, and Nietzsche, and this whole concept that sort of, people had lost faith in the idea of omniscience, and that omniscience is very sort of God-like. So suddenly you have someone like Virginia Woolf feeling the need to approach the novel in a very, very different way. And instead of pretending that there is some sort of omniscient narrator who is, providing, predestination and is providing answers and is giving everybody, their destiny, you have, books like Mrs. Dalloway, where you are inside the brain of a lot of different people, or to The Lighthouse, where you have, a narrator who is skipping from person to person throughout the entire family. And these are books that are fragmented. They are not linear. They're much less focused on plot. Along with the modernist novel comes a certain stylistic thing that has a certain richness and that begins to kind of play outside the lines, meaning it's not sticking, to this omniscient narrator and a very kind of realistic world. It is, in fact, adding, a little bit more embellishment and a little bit more exaggeration. So we have this incredible description here of the lawn as personified. So the lawn is running along, it's jumping over sundials. And then when it reaches this house, it is climbing up the walls. And later he talks about the lawn coming right into, this great room, this solarium where all the people are sitting. So you have this idea of a world that isn't quite functioning the way that the normal world does, one that's being overtaken by, in this case, the force of nature, but it's a very manicured nature. And of course, when the lawn is jumping over sundials, you should be thinking about time and mortality and death. But you have this sense here of this manicured lawn and this wealth that is rising toward the house in this unusual and haunting and really striking way, again, that I think might have been lost on us if we were not thinking a bit about the realist novel versus the modernist, and not thinking a little bit beyond sophomore English. We're going to look at just one or two more ways in which Nick Carraway is just incredibly flexible as a narrator. So right across on page 7, sometimes you have him doing these kind of speculative things. So he's now talking about this is something that he imagines that Tom Buchanan might say. Now, don't think that my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. So we have this thing here where Nick is essentially inventing a sentence that might have been spoken, or he imagines might be spoken, by Tom Buchanan. This kind of speculation is really strange. And again, this is kind of a modernist thing. It's in quotations. It looks like part of the dialogue, but this is something, in fact, that Nick is imagining. And it's this kind of bold way to describe, some sort of subtle cues that he is getting, or not so subtle cues that he is getting, in fact, from Tom Buchanan. One other way that we can kind of move beyond Nick Carraway as a narrator, this is a scene, actually, we still have Tom Buchanan here with Nick Carraway. This is when Nick Carraway is having lunch with Gatsby at a club in New York City and runs into Tom Buchanan. "How have you been anyway?" demanded Tom of me. "How'd you happen to come up this far to eat?" "I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby." I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. Then we have a space break, and we have this. "One October day in 1917, parentheses, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden of the Plaza Hotel, I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns." So what I'm showing you here is that we have this sort of scene. It's a very novelistic scene. It has dialogue. We almost forget that Nick Carraway is our narrator, even though he's speaking in the first person. Then we have a space break, and then we have Jordan Baker's voice. It doesn't have any quotation marks. It simply, dives in. Oh my gosh, I did something. I think I did I gave like a peace sign and balloons. I'm getting a lot of balloons here. Wow. And she says, 1 October in 1917. So we have them going back in time, not super far back in time. And then you have this parentheses, and we have, this gloss that essentially tells us that Jordan, later that afternoon, sat down with Nick Carraway and told him this story. So what's so genius here is that very seamlessly and very effectively, there's a double M dash here, which is really impressive, and some parentheses. So Fitzgerald is leaning a little bit into line spacing and a little bit into grammar, but is very deftly giving us Jordan Baker now as the narrator. And Jordan Baker is discussing, information and an experience and a perspective that only she can have, because it was, experience that she had with Daisy back in 1917. But we get it told not in some weird, belabored way where Nick Carraway is trying to paraphrase Jordan. In fact, we simply are having Jordan's relation of this exchange, which is so genius. We have another point at the end of a section where he talks about how he was the only honest person he knew, which is, these little interjections occasionally that remind us that he is our narrator, but also that he is trustworthy. Sometimes he feels a little untrustworthy, and there's obviously an enormous amount of scholarship on Gatsby, and one of the things that people like to look at is how reliable Nick Carraway is as a narrator. And part of the confusion and the ambivalences that arise, I think, do grow from the fact that it's this incredibly multivalent and complex narration, even though it is essentially, this tale told by Nick Carraway, who has this adventure, this year-long experience with Gatsby, and then returns to the Midwest to write about it. We also had some, we have like little things like on page 101 where he has just given us essentially Gatsby's history, and it says, there's a space break, and then Nick Carraway says this. He told me all this very much later, but I've put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors. So we have these kinds of little reminders and little signposts that we're getting this story told from Nick Carraway, but in fact, Nick Carraway is essentially reporting verbatim what he has heard from these other very important players. So all of that about Nick Carraway is to say that honestly, that Fitzgerald is this incredible genius. I want to touch for a second on the structure of the novel, and we're going to sort of do a recap, which is actually so interesting to do. This is a novel that has a lot of complex plot points. There is a lot happening here. It's kind of deceiving, because in many ways the absolute sort of grandeur of the prose and the richness of all of the scenes that Fitzgerald is creating tend to kind of mask some of this really intricately done and really very skilled plot that is happening. And the structure of it, in some ways, feels very kind of innovative and interesting, and also very straightforward. So we have 9 chapters. They are numbered. We have in the beginning this kind of introduction of East Egg versus West Egg, this idea of old money versus new money. We have the idea of Nick and his being somewhat outside of this group of people. We then have the chapter where we are introduced to Tom, Daisy, and Jordan. Jordan, who is the golfer and also a cheater. And we have this sense here of the possibilities of women. So that is a whole vein that we are not going to look into too deeply. But you have this sense of Daisy, who is Daisy Faye, who is, like a flower. We also have this, the daisy is famously the thing where you would say, she loves me not. So we have this idea of someone who is somewhat inconstant, and also someone who is Faye in the sense of being, sort of like weak and kind of like almost always about to fall onto her fainting chair. So you have this Daisy Faye is very, like her name is very indicative. And then we have Jordan, and Jordan is, an ambiguous name in terms of gender. She is someone who is a golfer. She's someone who is incredibly independent. She's driving cars, and she's entering competitions, and she's really emblematic in many ways of the liberated woman during this era. So we have these kinds of extremes, and then of course we have Myrtle. So Myrtle, who is really interested in some sort of materialistic advancement in her life. She lives, of course, with her husband over the garage, and is having an affair with Tom Buchanan. So we have her and her sister as an example of sort of, you would have called her like a more coarse woman or something. But we have this idea of Myrtle, who is sort of sexualized, but also incredibly just like kind of doomed. And then we have Daisy Faye, who is sort of untouchable, and Jordan, who is the archetype of the more sort of liberated and in some ways more masculine kind of woman. So moving back to the structure, though, we have the intro, we have Tom, Daisy, and Jordan. Then we have this, all of the stuff where it is revealed, in fact, that Tom, he brings Nick into the city with him, and they have that kind of day of debauchery, and he realizes and Nick Carraway realizes that Tom is having the affair with Myrtle. Then we have one of the parties at Gatsby's house. Nick begins to, recognize the excess of this party, and also begins to understand that Gatsby is at the center of this, but he is really not enjoying himself. He is at these parties, but only in order to see if Daisy comes, and is definitely not partaking in all the revelry. Then we have part and parcel with this chapter are all these questions of his identity. And it gets to be very convoluted whether he is, part of organized crime, or, how in fact he got his money. And there's a lot of rumors and he himself is, sort of a party to this in terms of stoking the flames with the rumors. Then we have Gatsby, Nick, and Wolfsheim in New York City, and we have this idea again of these kind of shady business dealings. We have some fairly anti-Semitic stuff then too, which is not great. This is a time to, there's a scene that's very clear to me where they are crossing a bridge into New York City, and a beautiful car drives by, and there are many Black people in the car, and it's sort of a beautiful description of the power of these people, and they're having a great time. And in many ways, that group of people, it's this kind of gorgeous, probably a little fetishized vision of this group of people who are in fact in many ways much happier and much more a part of a community, and are experiencing a sort of happiness that the people driving into the city, Nick and Tom Buchanan, are not in fact enjoying. So this would have been during, I believe, right at the start of the Harlem Renaissance. So there would have been, also Tom is a total racist. In the beginning, there's all this stuff about, he has a book about essentially that the white race is superior for all of these different sort of medical reasons. So importantly, Tom Buchanan, who is often, he's sort of the villain of the book in many ways, he is the one who is racist. There are some, racist and anti-Semitic elements of the book that certainly, need to be acknowledged. So we have the lunch with Wolfsheim, and then we have the long part where Jordan essentially reveals Gatsby's love for Daisy and how that all happened when they were young people. Daisy comes to tea then at Gatsby's house. That's that beautiful part where he knocks the clock off the mantle, and it's very symbolic because the clock is broken and time is stopping, and it's a very loaded and very symbolic moment. That is also the time when we have the very famous scene where Daisy is in the house, is in Gatsby's house, and is just reveling in all of these fabulous shirts. So those of you who are on YouTube can see that I'm wearing a very fabulous white button-down shirt. It's very old. It has like these incredible cuffs. It's just like it's I think the most beautiful shirt that I own. But I have this little theory. Two books that I've read recently. One is the new Ellen Hildebrand, which I'm enjoying. That book made a reference to Gatsby's shirts. And there was something else I read a couple of years ago that was also a reference to Gatsby's shirts. And in my mind, I lumped these together with an episode of Family Guy where Lois does this whole thing. It's Family Guy, doing a retake of The Great Gatsby, which is actually very entertaining and interesting. But there's this part where Lois is throwing all of the shirts and just yelling, shirts, shirts, shirts. And my own personal theory is that all of these references to Gatsby's shirts that have come after are actually like references more to the Family Guy episode than they are to the shirts. I think the Family Guy episode really put a spotlight on those shirts and in fact brought them into the collective consciousness. Okay, but so we have Daisy over to tea, and then at that point, once Gatsby has reacquainted himself with Daisy and has reconnected with her, he fires everyone, he stops all of the parties, and this is when things begin, in fact, to decline. Then we have one of the big parties, and Tom comes, and then we have the climactic scene where we have the car accident, and we in fact realize that it was Daisy who was driving. Daisy has killed Myrtle, but Gatsby takes the fall, and then George is trying to avenge his wife's murder and comes and kills Gatsby. Why are we discussing all of that structure? Part of the reason is because this is a departure from modernism. So when you have a book like Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa is going to buy the flowers. She goes out and buys the flowers. And at the end of the book, we have the party. It is not a book that is rich in plot. A lot happens. Septimus Smith, in fact, kills himself, and Peter Walsh and Clarissa sort of reconnect. So there are important things that are happening, and certainly the psychology is rich, but there's not a lot of plot that's going on. One of the ways that we really can look at Gatsby as not a modernist novel is this plot. So the structure and the plot are very straightforward in the sense of the kind of inexorability of the plot. We know from the start, because in fact Nick Carraway tells us that Gatsby is doomed. And we know fairly early on, or at least we can intuit it, that things are not going to go well with him and Daisy. We don't know how things are going to unfold, but there is an inevitability of the whole thing. So part of what I want to underscore with this discussion of the structure is this kind of impossibility of the American dream. So, in many ways, Fitzgerald was living the American dream, lots of money, living in Paris, lots of parties, fast cars, elegant clothing. But there is this sense of the American dream as being hollow. You have the great Gatsby who is living in this incredible home and who has all of this material wealth and who is unhappy. And in fact, you can argue, we learned in the very beginning, that Tom Buchanan has peaked at age 21, and Daisy is certainly not happy, and Daisy is convinced that her daughter is not going to be happy. So you have this sense of everyone, even the people who have attained the American dream, are not in fact happy. So you have this idea of kind of the inevitability of this dream as being impossible. And in the sense that, yes, you can attain the American dream, but it is not going to in fact provide you what you think it will, meaning happiness. So it's an indictment in some ways of the American dream that I think is very important. And this kind of the fated nature of these people, FATED, like the fact that they, their fate is in fact to not do well and to not be happy. All of this is reinforced by kind of the inevitability, the way that we're kind of like barreling toward this climax that is really catastrophic for a large number of people. It involves 2 murders and, sort of the explosion of many lives. I want to read 3 passages that not only allow us to just revel in this incredible prose and to see the breadth. This is incredible dialogue and description and all of these different things we haven't been able to fully touch on yet. I want to look at these 3 examples, though, because this is part of that idea of this, of how carefully structured and carefully crafted the book is in terms of plot, because we have all of these times when driving comes up, and we have this sense of the doom that is going to befall people behind the wheel. So it's almost a sense of foreshadowing that we are seeing at these different important points, and the careful reader will see that all of these different signposts are pointing toward the fact that there's going to be this terrible accident. So on page 54, this is in the very early morning at Gatsby's house after a night of debauchery. This is when the car is in, the fountain. And there's one of the people speaking here. This is a whole group of people. One of the people is Owl Eyes. So he has these glasses on, and he was upstairs in the library. So you need to think of Owl Eyes. He also, in your mind, should be related a little bit to T.J. Eckelberg, who is the guy on the billboard, the image of the optometrist who is looking over everything in this godlike fashion. But in this case, Owl Eyes is someone who's wise. He's this owl. He's also wise in the sense, he has glasses so he can see what's going on in a way that all of these other guests of the party who are now super drunk, and it's early in the morning, and they are trying to figure out what has happened. How did it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing whatever about mechanics, he said decisively. But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Owl Eyes, washing his hands of the whole matter. I know very little about driving, next to nothing. It happened, and that's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you oughtn't to be trying to drive at night. But I wasn't trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. An awed hush fell upon the bystanders. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel, a bad driver, and not even trying. You don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car. So this is this foreshadowing of the climax, this idea of not wanting to commit suicide and not trying, and this idea of another person being in the car. So the sort of turn here is that there's another person who was driving, which, is a foreshadowing of the way that Gatsby and Daisy, when they are driving into the city, Gatsby will essentially take the fall. It is Daisy who is driving the car that hits Myrtle. So very much like this case, there is confusion about who is driving the car. Then we have on just a couple of pages later, on page 58, this is when Nick is very sort of softly berating Jordan for not being a great driver. You're a rotten driver, I protested. Either you ought to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all. I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are, she said lightly. What's that got to do with it? They'll keep out of my way, she insisted. It takes 2 to make an accident. Suppose you met somebody just as careless as yourself. I hope I never will, she answered. I hate careless people. That's why I like you. So this idea of driving is very important, and this idea of people who are careless, and the idea of it taking 2. I mean, essentially, poor Myrtle is run over by a car driven by Daisy, and in fact, it's not, Myrtle's not being careless, the victim is not being careless here, but in fact, Daisy is the one who is being careless. So again, we have this measure of foreshadowing here. There's also much made later on of the fact that Tom and Daisy Buchanan are very careless people. The foreshadowing of this vehicular climax that we are going to have is on page 77. This is Jordan speaking. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon out on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. So again, here we have a car crash, and it's revealing another sort of sticky situation. So in every one of these times, I mean, nothing in this book is sort of casual or accidental or gratuitous. Every time we have a car crash, it's showing us something very important. So whether it's the fact that Jordan is a careless person and that Nick is the only person who is not careless in the book, or whether it's showing us that Tom is, in fact, even on their honeymoon, is being unfaithful to Daisy and that he's really really a horrible person. Each one of these times that is foreshadowing, we're kind of ratcheting up the tension as we are moving toward the climax of the novel. So again, all of these different vehicular accidents are providing this kind of inexorable motion toward this momentum, toward the climax. You have this sense that we're kind of barreling toward this thing, and it is not going to be great. We're going to look at 4 quick passages about the American dream, and then we'll look at the close of the novel. On page 64, we have this moment when Nick is first really getting to know Gatsby. He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. A couple of important things here. The fact that Nick is talking about Americans as if he isn't one is perhaps one of these examples, Fitzgerald, as kind of, moving a little bit away from the idea of Nick as this very, limited narrator. But this idea of Americans, this absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, or even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. So you have the sense, you would certainly argue that the American dream is built on like grit and hard work and work ethic. But in this case, because these people, their version of the American dream is one that is sort of given to them, either generational wealth or just happening to, have the right like gold mine or whatever the thing is, you have the sense of things being given to them and that sort of ensuring that they're going to have this terrible fate. Gatsby is not one of those people, but he is still going to have a terrible fate. But this idea, too, of our nervous, sporadic games, this is another one of these incredible combinations of adjective and noun. Sporadic games is so, nervous, sporadic games is so interesting. And you do get the sense, these people are playing golf and they're playing polo and they're playing football. And you have the sense of them as being gamblers and playing games, but games that, in fact, have a very high stakes in many ways. Those games don't necessarily, but the games that they're playing in terms of their marriage or their faithfulness or their finances or whatever the thing is. So this idea here, though, of nervous, sporadic games, it's unusual, and it also speaks to this idea of the kind of instability that we have that we have in Gatsby that Nick is beginning to appreciate. And of course, the reason why that had to do with the American dream is this idea of the American dream on some level as also being a game, and this idea of Gatsby as kind of performing this person who is, untethered and sort of not grounded. So then on page 92, and this is a description of a dream. It's a little bit less the American dream and a little bit more his idea of Daisy, but in many ways you can look at this idea of Daisy as sort of the culminating piece of his American dream. He wants all of this money and he wants all of this material stuff in order to attract her. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. So again, a clock should always signal to you, mortality and the idea of time running out. Then we have on page 179, here we have the part about them being careless. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. So in many ways, the American dream is sort of encapsulated, it's sort of embodied by Gatsby's house. So you all have heard me say before that whenever you come across a house in literature, you should look at the ways it might be symbolic of the people who live in it and what is happening in their lives. If it's choked with weeds or vines, or if the roof is caving in, then that might signal that the family inside is not doing very well. This is very obvious. And I think actually some of the best literary tropes are obvious. They should be extensions of sort of common sense. They should grow out of literature organically. But you have, in this case, Gatsby's home is in fact very emblematic of the American dream. And at the end, we see the ways in which the American dream has failed. So on 179, we have a space break. This is at the very end of the novel. And we have Nick say this: Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. I mean, the house is empty. Then we jump down to the next paragraph. With my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. So we have at the beginning of this section, which is right toward the end, the idea that the house is empty, and then this huge incoherent failure of a house. Once again, we have two incredible and unexpected adjectives before this very important noun. But this incoherent failure is, you might as well say, an incoherent and failed version of the American dream. It's just not working for him. So, I mean, every time I'm saying American dream, I'm meaning this kind of myth that if you amass enough wealth and that if you have a big enough house and if you have, fancy enough parties, that you will in fact be happy. The house is highly emblematic of that here, and yet it has not brought him happiness. We're now going to look at the close of the novel. It's just such an incredibly gorgeous close. So the very last line is in fact pretty famous and one that confused me for the longest time. The last line is this. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So I was a little bit like, I'm not sure I understand why we are ending the book with this image. And I think it's very important to look at this in the sense of the American dream and the way that at the very end here, Fitzgerald is widening the scope. He's bringing us sort of backwards in history. He's talking about colonialism, essentially. He's talking about the Dutch having come and discovered these islands. He's talking about, the United States. He's talking about these huge homes that were seeking, in fact, to turn these islands into the the apotheosis of American wealth. So this idea of talking about these explorers and the Dutch and this kind of land that they had arrived at, and then the idea of being born ceaselessly into the past. This is at a time, I'm sure that Fitzgerald at least once or twice took a steamer to Europe. This would have been a time he was living in France. He was definitely there in the 20s, but you have this idea of him. He also served in the First World War. So you have this idea of a very keen notion, to borrow an adjective from that era, of a very strong sensibility of Europe versus the United States and kind of the oldness of Europe, and in some ways the sort of better aspects of kind of the old country versus the new country. So this idea of being ceaselessly born into the past, I think in many ways is talking about this idea of an America that was an illusion. It was possibility, and it's the Dutch people he's talking about arriving, partly because it is New York and it was settled by the Dutch, but also it's not the English. It's not the people who ended up colonizing, the New World. So I want to now read it. And as I am reading, I'm just going to read the last part because it is so beautiful. As I am reading, think a little bit about this idea of colonialism and the American dream, but also the colors at the end here are so beautiful. And this is another one of these modernist touches where he's not trying to be realistic in the description. In fact, he's trying to do kind of like an impressionist thing. I mean, think about the surrealism and all of that, kind of all of those isms that are beginning to happen, modernism and cubism and fauvism and all the ways that colors were really being used in art. And you have them here evoked in a way that is so beautiful. So I'm going to read these last couple of paragraphs, and you can just revel in this incredible prose. And of course, there's mention here of the green light. So this entire time, Gatsby has been able to see the light at the end of her dock, at the end of Daisy's dock. And, you can imagine the green light as being like a green light, the sense of possibility, the sense of renewal, the sense of growth. Green is all, sort of evokes all of the idea of spring and growth and renewal. It also evokes jealousy. Whenever you see something green, you should think of jealousy. And certainly Gatsby is jealous of the fact that Tom Buchanan is getting to have this domestic life with Daisy. But it's also very important, the idea of a beacon, the idea of a light, in the fog, the idea of a lighthouse, that kind of thing, and the idea of it being far away but visible to him. So this green light, comes up here in this last passage. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. Face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eludes us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. It's so beautiful. I am just going to let those words resonate with you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you've really enjoyed the absolute mastery and genius of Scott Fitzgerald and this American classic. Happy reading.